I'm going to talk about Nungon switch reference, processing and acquisition. Nungon is a Papuan language of the Finisterre subgroup of the Finisterre-Huon family. I should note that locally there was no tradition of describing a Nungon language per se. It's that each village in a sort of dialect continuum that centers around the Uruwa River here had its own distinctive dialect, and village names were historically the main language variety identifiers used. Recall that Papuan-style clause chains involve one or more medial clause with a medial verb predicate that is underspecified for tense and other categories, followed by a single final clause with a final verb predicate that is fully specified for tense and other categories. Now, why are clause chains remarkable? Well, they represent a morphologically demarcated syntactic unit that is without a counterpart in languages like English. They also potentially are extremely long, measured in clauses. So in Nungon, easily more than 20 clauses in one chain. And in other languages like Japanese and Aguaruna, a story in one chain style is attested, in which an entire narrative is told as a single clause chain. Another point of interest is that, again, the tense and often mood information for the entire chain only becomes explicit in a verb at the very end of the chain. So the question is, when do listeners become aware of this information? And last, there's that switch reference marking. So switch reference marking is in many of these languages, it is a morpheme at the end of the verb that announces in advance whether the subject of the next clause, be it medial or final, will be the same as or different from the subject of the current clause. So this is obligatorily marked for all medial verbs. Now in Nungon, switch reference marking takes the following forms. In a same subject context, that is where the subject of clause A is announced to be identical to the subject of clause B, that is co-referent, fully co-referent. It's a simple marking nga for vowel final roots, as in tonga, du, same subject, or a for consonant final roots, as in ura, cry, same subject. In different subject contexts, Nungon is one of those Papuan languages identified by Roberts 1997, where in the different subject context, the switch reference markers actually inflect for the person number of the current subject. Here's an example of a Nungon clause chain. This was actually written in a text message that I received by mobile phone in November. Da, osuk yonga kiwadma, go oro hiwiya, oro ina, wo mai oro opnarot not even borong dek toraya, wo mai oro honto huya, nonton yoku yego dek onha. Sister, as for the question that I put down first, relative clause embedded in a medial clause, you understanding it, different subject, it being good, different subject, then good, my husband and I taking, different subject, something to pay people from our money, then good, you all putting it, different subject. Could it go into our new account, question marker? So I'd like to point out a few things about this. First, again, there's that embedded relative clause, which is a final clause embedded within a medial clause. These medial clauses can, of course, be complex. Then of the 4 medial clauses, all of those medial verbs are marked for different subject. And switch reference strictly follows the grammatical subject, regardless of animacy, imageability, etc. So again, here we have question or situation being the subject, grammatical subject of the second medial clause, and that has triggered switch reference, a different subject marking on the previous medial verb of that first medial clause. And then finally, only at the very end, remember that this is written in a text message, does the reader or listener learn that the entire clause chain doesn't describe something that happened in the remote past, it doesn't describe something that's predicted to happen in the future, near future, remote future. It's framed in the counterfactual modality, and it's a question. So that question marker comes at the very, very end. So these all lead us to think about processing. When people hear these things, when they produce these, what's going on in their brain, what's going on in their mind. Switch reference marking in particular apparently requires that speakers know in advance whether the upcoming clause will have a different subject. Now, does this accord with what we know about sentence planning from other languages? Well, a number of studies have demonstrated that the clause, so a single clause, is an important unit for planning and possibly the maximal unit for planning at the syntactic level. 2 studies on English have demonstrated partial planning across 2 clauses, but one of these involved embedded relative clauses in a very, very particular sort of template, and the other involved very simple repetitive coordination. No one has shown definitively for English or other languages that speakers plan the subject of an upcoming clause in advance when narrating sequences of related actions and events akin to a Papuan clause chain. So if we can demonstrate that speakers of Papuan languages like Nungon plan their speech when producing clause chains farther ahead than do speakers of English, this could be important information for parents and communities to consider when deciding the fates of their languages. And with this in mind, I and some colleagues targeted Nungon switch reference experimentally. We ran 2 studies to begin to investigate how Nungon speakers process switch reference marking with a number of collaborators. And we ran them in Towat village of Morobe province in the Uro River Valley area. So this involved adaptation of laboratory-based methods to a remote field context. The first study I'll talk about is EEG. So we want to investigate again how Nungon speakers process switch reference. So we manipulated clause chains from an existing Nungon adult speech corpus in 3 ways. In condition 1, we had different subject markers and we just changed them to be the wrong person number. That is the wrong person number of clause A marked in the marker on clause A. In condition 2, we had different subject marking in clause A, and we changed it to same subject marking even though the subject in clause B changed. And in condition 3, we did the reverse. We had same subject marking, we changed it to different subject marking. We had 48 native speakers of Towat Nungon participated, and they listened to the clause chains, some that were manipulated, some that were not, and some fillers. This is what it looked like. So we are maybe one of the first or the first team to run a psycholinguistic experiment using EEG in such a remote location. And indeed, our headsets did not have the full set of array of electrodes that you would have in the laboratory, which limits the number of things we're able to look at. Here's my collaborator Alba Tuninetti and research assistant Ujel Itari, again, affixing a headset to a participant's head. And again, attaching the nodes, watching on screen to make sure they're doing it the right way. Again, and again. And I'd like to mention that all the furniture and everything else you see in these pictures was handcrafted by Nungon speakers for the purpose of doing this sort of research. So here's early results. Here's condition 1. We had the wrong person number on a different subject marker. And you can see that indeed, when we have the grammatical line, which is the solid black line, the brain electrical activity is patterning quite differently than the ungrammatical line. Now, our overall aim with this EEG study is in some ways limited by the type of headset we were using and the number of electrodes. We're able to try to confirm that Nungon speakers' brain activity accords with our understanding of Nungon switch reference grammatically. And we're also able to aim to obtain remote field-based evidence for ERP measures such as the N400. In the eye tracking study, however, we're able to hone in on these major questions of speech advanced planning and listening to switch reference marking. We had 2 blocks to this experiment. In the comprehension block, participants listened to 15 excerpts, 2 to 29 seconds in duration, from Nungon narratives that included clause chains and switch reference markers, as they viewed displays with 2 to 5 images that represented grammatical subjects described in the excerpts. So here's an example. They would see these images, and they would hear a clause chain that translates as dismantling, same subject, then they dismantling different subject, 1, then a man shot final. This is the setup. This is a very electricity intensive setup because it requires 2 laptops. Everything that we have here is solar powered, of course. And this is Lynn Ogate, one of my longtime field-based collaborators, running a participant through the comprehension block. After they did the comprehension block, then the same participants would do production. So they then put on a microphone, and they were told that they would see the same screens as before, but now they should tell the stories themselves. They could either say what they heard before or say something else, including, if they wanted, just a simple description. So here's an example of what one participant produced for that same image that we saw before. Thus, one man, then they dismantling different subject offense. He shot final at them. So our major questions here are, first, for comprehension. Do listeners use switch reference markers as cues to prediction? We know that when people listen to speech, they predict what they think the speaker is going to say next. The question is switch reference marking helping them do this? And for production, how far in advance do speakers plan switch reference markers? And by extension, since switch reference markers are, in a sense, grammatical signposts to something that comes later, the subject, the next clause, how far in advance are they planning the subject of that next clause? But how do we measure this? So if you think about the structure of switch reference, we have a clause A and a clause B, and a clause A has subject X. That's a given. Then the medial verb in clause A has some sort of switch reference marker. If it's same subject, then the subject of clause B is also X. But if it's different subject, the subject of clause B is Y. So what we did to evaluate what people are doing is we looked at the relationship between the type of switch reference marker in clause A, SS or DS, and the person's gaze toward or away from the image depicting subject X. So the subject of that clause A. Here are results for comprehension. Listeners who heard a same subject marker, and you can see that group with the purple line here, they did indeed look more to the subject of clause A, that subject X, which is same subject in the graph, than did people who heard a different subject marker, the red line here. But this difference between the two groups becomes significant over 1,000 milliseconds after the onset of the morpheme itself, indicating that the morpheme itself is not the major impetus for the gaze differentiation. When we look at production, however, it's a different story. Again, we've got speakers who produced a same subject marker and speakers who produced a different subject marker. And their gaze diverged nearly 3,000 milliseconds before the onset of the morpheme itself, with statistical significance. So what this tells us is that speakers of Nungon plan their switch reference markers nearly 3 seconds in advance. And this is much, much greater than the 1 second eye voice span known for English, where people look at something about a second before they describe it in words. And of course, planning of the switch reference morphemes themselves seems to entail some planning of the subject of the subsequent clause because of the nature of the morphemes. So this advanced planning may be on an even greater scale. In contrast, listeners do not seem to rely on switch reference markers as signposts to direct them to the next subject in comprehension. This could be due to the impoverished semantics of the different subject marker in particular. It says what not to look at, but this is not enough information, especially when there's more than 2 images on a screen or in an actual discourse context, to determine with certainty where to look or what to predict. Now we'll turn to acquisition. Can the children switch? What do they do with clause chains? And I direct you to a collection of papers, the first major studies of the acquisition of clause chaining in any languages, edited by myself and Sunja Choi in 2020 in Frontiers in Psychology. So the question here is, given the advanced planning evident by adult Nungon speakers, switch reference marking and clause chains appears to require considerable mental resources to produce, Do children show any signs of simplification of this task? For instance, do they go through an initial stage of producing only same subject morphemes? With the assumption that their chain will be same subject, perhaps they can avoid having to overthink who the subject of the next clause will be. And how long are their clause chains anyway? So here's an overview of what I found looking at 3 children. In the youngest child, the first 2 clause chains are evident by age 2 and 4 months, and these include different subject marking. In a middle child, the first clause chains, 2 clause chains again, are evident at 2 years, 5 months. Different subject morphology is produced on a medial verb at 2 years, 4 months, but not within a chain. And the first different subject chains are produced at 2 years, 10 months, the first 3 clause chains at 3 years, 1 month. And finally, the oldest child, 2 clause, same subject, and different subject chains were produced until 3 years, 1 month, when he also began producing longer clause chains. For all 3 children, clause chains are the earliest complex sentence type produced, and they greatly outpace sentences with subordinated or coordinated final clauses from about 3 years for both older children. So you can see as the solid black line really takes off, and the other 2 lines representing subordination and coordination of final clauses stay much lower in terms of number of tokens per session. Now, incidentally, study of clause chain acquisition enabled me and Sunja Choi to identify a possibly universal 2-clause stage for children acquiring clause chain languages. That is, before producing longer chains, children seem to universally spend some time producing only 2-clause chains. Well, it makes a lot of sense, but no one had ever thought to look into this because no one really cared about counting the number of clauses in a sentence for languages like English and German and Dutch, whereas it's extremely relevant for clause chains, of course. What about switch reference marking in the child's speech? Well, by 2 years, 10 months, both of the older children produced 2 clause chains with both same subject and different subject markers. And this is around the time when they're beginning to produce more clause chains as well. This is very different from the Papuan language Kuwaru, described by Rumsey et al. In our edited volume, Frontiers in Psychology, where most children studied never produced any different subject markers. And the eldest, who did, had a delay of almost 2 years between his first same subject 2 clause chains and his first different subject clause chain at 4 years, 7 months. So, especially looking at the difference between these 2 languages, it appears that distributions in adult speech are the key here. Different subject markers happen to be extremely rare in Kuwaru in general, child-directed speech and adult-directed speech. So this is not necessarily due to any processing difficulties with producing different subject markers. In sum, we ran 2 experiments, EEG and eye tracking, that targeted processing of switch reference markers by Nungon-speaking adults. Thus far, the results point to robust advanced planning, perhaps more than is attested for other languages, by speakers, and no reliance on switch reference markers to predict by listeners. Children acquiring Nungon as a first language go through a 2-clause production phase before expanding into longer clause chains. They do not show evidence of a protracted same subject only phase, unlike children learning Kuwaru. Clause chains are the first complex sentence type they produce, without, I should mention, morphological errors, so they don't alter medial verb morphology. And from 3 years on, they produce many more clause chains than other complex sentence types. It could be then that children who speak Nungon are already expert advanced speech planners. And the question is, will this type of evidence be effective, useful in convincing speakers of this sort of switch reference marking language, of the importance of maintaining their languages? And can we draw on psycholinguistic experiments around the world to influence parents as they decide what to teach their children? Thank you.